Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dear colleagues, today I want to seize the opportunity to thank the senators, clerks, library analysts, interpreters, pages, and other staff who participated in the work of the Committee on Rules, Procedures, and the Rights of Parliament, which I had the privilege and honour of chairing since December 2021. And I wish to hand it over to Senator Odette, who is going to be taking over after I leave the chair. As you know, senators carry out their constitutional responsibilities in the House and at committee. Bills introduced by the government, senators, and MPs are studied in detail at committee. And in committee, senators carry out special duties which can last a few years or a few months. Most senators really enjoy committee work, which is generally carried out in a relaxed atmosphere. To shorten my speech, I will take the liberty of referring to the Senate standing committees by their colloquial name rather than their official name. Today, there are 18 standing Senate committees. 5 are administrative and procedural in nature, such as Internal Economy, Rules, Ethics, and Audit Committees, and the Selection Committee. The other 13 committees, which I identify as thematic, because they deal with a theme, such as social affairs, or a sector like transportation and communications. These 13 committees, thematic committees rather, share the study of bills and carry out special studies. The rules also allow for creating time-limited special committees and legislative committees. Senators also sit on joint standing and temporary committees. Special studies undertaken by committees are not academic research. They're based on existing knowledge from various academic, scientific, associative, and institutional circles. Their aim is to identify avenues for public policy that could improve Canadians' well-being. The structure and mandates of Senate standing committees have not been amended since 2002, and that was the goal of the study. That was the goal of the 6th report, to look at the first step of a new study regarding the structure and mandates of committees. So, the 6th report summarizes testimony heard during a special study undertaken in early 2023, intended to propose substantive changes to the mandates of the 13 thematic committees in order to better respond to Canadians' concerns. It follows from the committee's 3rd report, which proposed stylistic and minor changes to the regulations and harmonized the description of committees' mandates. And the 3rd report was adopted on May 12, 2023. The first step of the background study on committee mandates consisted of hearing evidence from current or former chairs and vice chairs of the 13 standing committees, which I call the thematic committees. They were asked whether any changes should be made to their mandates, the number of members per committee, their composition, the schedule of their meetings, the way they operate, their workload, the effectiveness of their work, the issue of orders of reference from the Senate, and to look into technical and material capacity of the committees to fulfill their mandates properly. Witnesses suggested changes of all kinds, such as changing the witness selection process and legislative follow-ups in order to better ensure the independence and quality of our work. Several witnesses said they appreciated that exercise. They suggested that the Rules Committee should be able to repeat this exercise at regular intervals. Senate Clerks Shaila Anwar, Till Hyde, and Adam Thompson also attended and appeared before the committee. I thank them for their thoughtful testimony. You'll find a complete list of witnesses at the end of the report, which I invite you to read in order to get more details. Because of the apparent difficulty of proposing consensual changes to the current terms of reference and structure of standing committees, Committee work on this subject came to a halt after this first stage. The challenge of adapting committee structures and their mandates is not new. Several committees have existed since the Senate was established. For example, the Banking, Internal Economy, Rules, and Joint Library of Parliament committees were created in 1867, followed a few years later by the Transportation Committee. Periodically, the Senate made changes to structure, name, mandate of those committees, abolishing some and creating others. According to various documents we consulted, significant changes were made in 1945, in 1968, in 1985, and in 2002. It is now 2024, so I think we're due for some changes. According to the library's research, the 1968 reform was the most important, most significant. As summarized in the Senate Procedure and Practice, and I quote, "Some were renamed, others were created, and broad areas of competence were defined. After this reorganization, there were 8 standing Senate committees and 3 standing joint committees. Over the years, this number gradually increased. In 1983, the size of most standing committees was reduced from 20 to 12 members, and quorum was adjusted accordingly." So to summarize, essentially, after 1968, the number of committees went up, which required them to reduce the size of those committees because there was a limit to how many senators we could have participating. Since I was appointed to the Senate in 2012, few significant changes were made to the committee structure and mandates, with the exception of creating a temporary special committee, such as Senate Modernization, the Arctic Committee, and the Committee on Charitable Organizations. As a senator and as chair of a committee, I've observed that although the challenge of adapting committees' work to the current economic, social, political, and climate environment seems important to me, the capacity and perhaps the will of the Senate to change its ways of doing things isn't there yet. The 6th report contains no recommendations. The committee met 18 times. All the committee meetings were public, and so you can go and refer to them if you wish. It's not yet possible to establish a consensus to make changes because, in the context of the Senate's limited resources, any change usually involves reallocating existing resources. Reallocating resources implies change. Some experience change as a loss. I remain optimistic, however, that major changes will come one day. The last major change to committee structure goes back to the year 2000, before artificial intelligence, the violent effects of climate change, and great demographic upheavals. The main changes were made to the regulations in 2002. 3 committees were created. Official languages, which used to be a joint committee and it was so until 1984, the Human Rights Committee, and the National Defense and Veterans Committee. The mandate of the Fisheries Committee, which existed in its own right since 1986, was amended to include oceans. In 2011, I wasn't here yet, but just before, I know that the meetings were important. The Rules Committee, then chaired by Senator David Smith, proposed further changes in its 4th report to the Senate in order to broaden the scope of some committees and modernize their mandates. For example, the report suggested that transportation be dealt with by the Banking Committee, whose remit would also include international trade. It suggested that national defense be dealt with by Foreign Affairs, and to create a Natural Resources Committee in order to cover fisheries, oceans, agriculture, and forestry, and to establish a new Science, Technology, and Communications Committee. The committee's 4th report from 2011 was not accepted. It did not pass. In 2019, during the pandemic, a group of independent senators, chaired by the late Senator José Forêt-Nizing, examined committee's work. An informal survey was conducted to gauge senators' appetite for change. The results showed a wide range of opinions. So, I would like to share my thoughts on the matter. The testimony I heard in committee inspired me, as well as an analysis of the data on committee working hours. This data came from the Library and Committee Services Directorate, whom I would like to thank. So this helped me to better understand how work is distributed among senators. The partial analysis enabled me to identify issues that a longer-term statistical analysis could add on to. I compared working hours for each of the standing committees that were thematic in nature. I looked at the total hours as well as time spent studying bills and time spent on special studies. I compared this data for 3 years, just before the pandemic, 2018-2019, and 2 years after the pandemic, 2022-2023, and 23-24. And here's a few highlights. First of all, committee working hours vary greatly from one committee to another. Finance, legal affairs, and social affairs always dedicate more committee time than the average of the other committees. Secondly, for each of the years I noted, legislative work took up an average of 40 to 50% of committee hours. However, as I said, there's quite a bit of variation around this percentage per committee. National finance, legal affairs, and social affairs devote most of their time to studying bills and appropriations for the Finance Committee. So there's very little time for special studies at those 3 committees. 6 standing committees devote a significant part of their work to special studies: human rights, official languages, Indigenous affairs, agriculture and forestry, fisheries and oceans, and foreign affairs. So I'd like to present a few comments on those facts. First of all, the division of tasks at committee is necessarily different for each senator. Some senators will do a lot of legislative work, and some senators will mostly focus on special studies. So we can wonder how those were the conclusions of my statistical analysis, but were these findings specific to the period studied? Is this a permanent situation? Is it linked to the increase in public bills? Perhaps we needed to take a closer look at the data. Perhaps we should extend the number of years that are studied. However, without wanting to pass judgment on the importance of various committees' mandates, it must be said that the scope of standing committees' mandates varies considerably. They are different. They vary widely. On the one hand, we have 2 committees to deal with all legal matters and social affairs, including health, science, and technology, as well as issues related to labor. On the other hand, some committees have very specific mandates, such as fisheries and oceans, transport and communication, agriculture and forestry, national defense and veterans, and official languages. Inevitably, in that context, studying bills goes primarily to the Legal and Social Affairs committees, because many bills deal with those areas. So we can understand the frustration of some senators who would like the Senate to study more general and pressing issues such as artificial intelligence, the problem of the gig economy. We've often heard about that. Senator Lankin raised it quite a bit. Immigration, the phenomenon of social networks, and economic, political, and social polarization. So what do we do? I think we could do better. Senator Clément, your time has expired.
Looking for extra minutes to complete your remarks.
Please, I have 2 minutes.
Is leave granted?
Yes.
Merci.
Senator
Merci.
Spillman.
Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire devant ce constat?
So what can we do in the face of these conclusions? I think we could listen to what Senator MacDonald said. On April 16th, at committee, Senator MacDonald suggested, and I quote, "It would have been made easy."
That we're dealing with a blank slate. If we were creating all new committees for the first time, we would find to be a much easier exercise. Et c'est vrai, tout le monde a applaudi.
And everybody applauded that recommendation. My second suggestion is to analyze the structure and mandates in other senates around the world. We might find some solutions, or perhaps the beginnings of solutions. Here's what we might find, and here's some of what I found on my own. We could look at committee structure in some senates around the world, which includes, in addition to administrative and procedural committees, legislative committees, and special committees. That way, legislative work could be primarily done by committees set up for that purpose, and every senator could contribute. Special committees could carry out special studies, and our standing orders provide for this type of committee, but it's rarely used. Furthermore, in other jurisdictions, on paper, the number of special committees can be quite high because they study a lot of subjects. However, these committees are not all activated at the same time. They're only activated when the Senate adopts an order of reference for a special study. And these special studies are presented to the Senate after discussions in leadership committees. We need to see how this works. That means it's necessary to conduct a study of practices in other countries. But one thing is certain. The Senate is a very important institution, perhaps even more so in these uncertain and disrupting times. The Senate of Canada must have the ambition to be at the forefront of public debate on the major issues of the day. It can do great things, but it has to work differently. Thank you.